the Executive Director of the Army Heritage Center Foundation. The foundation is the Friends Group for the U.S. Army Heritage Education Center, the Army's premier archives and research facility dedicated to collecting the stories and memories of individual soldiers. Tonight, we're pleased to have General Leon Johnson back a second time. If you remember, he talked last year about the Tuskegee Airmen. This time he's moving in an earlier war. He's moving back down to World War I. General Johnson retired from the U.S. Air Force with the rank of Brigadier General after 33 years of service. During his Air Force career, General Johnson commanded a fighter squadron, fighter group, and was vice commander of the 10th Air Force at the Joint Reserve Base in Fort Worth, Texas, and served as mobilization assistant to the Secretary of the Air Force. A command pilot with over 3,500 hours of military flying time in the T-37 trainer, A-37, and A-10 fighter aircraft, including missions over Bosnia in support of Operation Deny Flight. Following the events of 9/11, the general served as director of the Air Force Crisis Action Team in the Pentagon. In 2009, General Johnson was selected as a trustee of the U.S. Air Force Academy Falcon Foundation. In 2011, General Johnson was awarded a doctorate in humane letters by Tuskegee University. In 2013, General Johnson concluded a 6-year appointment as a member of the U.S. National Academies of Science and Engineering Naval Studies Board. In November 2017, he concluded his second 3-year term as a Secretary of the Air Force appointee to the Civil Air Patrol Board of Governors. In April 2018, he was selected to be an emeritus member of the Civil Air Patrol Board of Governors, and in 2019 was selected to be a trustee for the association's foundation. General Johnson worked for the United Parcel Service Airlines for 20 years. He was the chief pilot responsible for all air operations of the western half of the United States, North and South Pacific, and all of Asia and the Middle East. He was also a resource manager responsible for employee relations, workforce development, and employment of the UPS airline. He has more than 4,000 hours of civilian flight time in heavy jets. General Johnson is a member of several organizations, including the Air Force Association, Military Officers Association of America, Military Order of World Wars, Veterans of Foreign Wars, Reserve Officer Association, League of Latin American Citizens, Women in Aviation, a founding member of the International Black Aerospace Council Incorporated, Tuskegee Airmen Incorporated, and Psi Sigma Phi fraternity. General Johnson was a Tuskegee Airmen Incorporated national president for 10 years. Sir, the floor is now yours.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to join you again this year. I'm here today to give you a presentation on a hero who accomplished things unheard of in his day. Who was the first Black American fighter pilot? When did he fly? World War I. Who did he fly for? France. Eugene James Bullard had to fly, and his persistence led him to find a way around the barriers he found in this country. Strength of character and ability to see a task through to its conclusion carried this man to a place in French and American history. He had painted on his airplane the phrase you see on the slide, which translates in English into "all blood runs red." With that as background, there is truly a lot more to this man's story. Let's get started. Slide, please. Eugene Bullard was born in Columbus, Georgia on 9 October 1895. He was the 7th of 10 children to William Bullard, a Black man who was from Martinique, and Josephine Thomas, a Creek Indian. His father's ancestors had been slaves in Haiti to French refugees who fled during the Haitian Revolution. They reached the United States and took refuge with the Creek Indians. Eugene had heard from his father that Blacks were treated fairly in France. Eugene's early youth was unhappy. He made several unsuccessful attempts to run away from home, one of which resulted in him being returned home and beaten by his father. In 1906, at the age of 11, Bullard ran away for good, and for the next 6 years, he wandered the South trying to get to France. In 1912, he stowed away on the Martha Russ, a German freighter bound for Hamburg, and ended up in Aberdeen, Scotland. The freighter was on its way to Hamburg, but had a fuel food stop in Scotland. The captain, as a stowaway, found him on board his ship, took a liking to him, put him to work. And as they approached the coast of Scotland, the captain put him in a lifeboat and said, "Scotland is that way." So he did not have to report him to the authorities. So that was how he got to Scotland. He eventually, working there, did whatever jobs he could find, including street performer, dock worker, target for an amusement park ride, helper on a fish market, and boxer, the last of which eventually took him to France. Bullard was instantly smitten, recalling later how it seemed to me that the French democracy influenced the mind of both white and Black Americans there and helped us to act like brothers as near as possible. Slide. 19-year-old Bullard joined the fabled French Foreign Legion in October of 1914 to fight for his adopted country against Germany. He was later transferred to a standard French army unit and fought at the Battle of Verdun, where he was seriously wounded attempting to carry a message from one French officer to another. The wound would take him out of ground combat permanently. His heroism would earn him the Cross de Guerre military decoration. It was during his convalescence at a clinic in Lyon when he became acquainted with a French air service officer who promised to help him become an aircraft gunner. The French officer made good on his word. In October of 1916, Bullard began training as a gunner at a military base near Bordeaux. There he learned about the Lafayette Escadrille, a squadron of American fighter pilots flying under the French flag. The Escadrille was well compensated and undeniably glamorous. Their mascots were two lion cubs named Whiskey and Soda. Bullard immediately asked to train as a pilot rather than as a gunner. He would receive his pilot's license 7 months later. Celebrating his achievement with friends in Paris, he later recalled that by midnight, every American in Paris knew that an American Negro by the name of Eugene Bullard, born in Georgia, had obtained a military pilot license. Next slide. History has a funny way of not always being remembered correctly. Frequently, you will see reference to Eugene Bullard as the first Black military pilot, and that's just not true. He was preceded by a few months by Ahmet Çelikten of the Ottoman Air Force. He started out training to be a naval officer and transitioned to flying. Ahmed completed his pilot training in November 1916, making him the first Black military pilot, and he was flying for the Ottoman Air Force. As World War I approached, the Ottoman military recognized the need to assemble an air force and began training pilots. He commenced his air cadet training in 1914 at Deniz near Istanbul and graduated on November 11, 1916. Several months before Frenchman Pierre Rijon and American Eugene Bullard, who was often credited with being the first Black military pilot. Next slide, please. Pierre Rijon was the first Black French military pilot. After a few months of training, he obtained his degree in September 26th of 1917 and became a military pilot on December of 1917. Rijon was assigned to Squadron N-160 and then Squadron N-64, where he piloted a Newport fighter plane. Finally, in June of 1918, he was assigned to Squadron SPA-62, which was known as the Squadron of Cox, where his aircraft was a SPAD-7. Rijon was shot down not once, not twice, but 3 times. But in each instance, he survived. Rijon damaged 11 German aircraft in combat, shooting down 4 of them. At the end of the conflict, he was awarded the French Cross de Guerre with bronze palm and the Belgian Cross de Guerre. Next slide, please. There has been a great deal of confusion over the years to the two names of the Lafayette Escadrille and the Lafayette Flying Corps. The Lafayette Escadrille is the unit itself, originally established on April 16th of 1916 and disestablished on February 18th of 1918. Its members were made up solely of the 38 Americans and 4 French who flew with the Escadrille during this period. The Escadrille was disbanded and reestablished as the U.S. 103rd Aero Pursuit Squadron. The Lafayette Flying Corps, also known as the Franco-American Flying Corps, was never a unit per se. Instead, it is a name used to describe all of the American pilots, to include the Lafayette Escadrille pilots who flew for the French during World War I. The exact number of actual pilots who flew for the French is open to question, and many different numbers exist depending on who's doing the counting. The number ranged from as low as 180 to over 300. The generally accepted most oft-quoted number of men were recognized as having successfully completed French flight training or received their wings is 209. Of those 209, 180 would actually serve at the front in combat. With this number in mind, then, 180 American pilots flew in 66 French pursuit escadrilles and 27 bomber observer escadrilles. The reasons that the Americans flew with the French instead of the U.S. Air Service after America's entrance into the war is as varied as the pilots themselves. Like the American pilots and ground crew that flew and worked for the Flying Tigers in World War II, most would have rather than fly with the U.S. Army Air Force's 14th Air Force that replaced the American Volunteer Group, simply decided to take their chances and returned home. The Lafayette Flying Corps achieved 199 confirmed victories. 13 men would become aces, 59 men would die in combat, and 6 from training accidents. 19 would be wounded, and 15 became prisoners of war. Next slide, please. The Lafayette Escadrille was the premier squadron of the American volunteers who went to France to fly for them during World War I. The squadron was originally named Escadrille Américaine. A German objection filed with the US government over the actions of a supposed neutral nation led to the name change to Lafayette Escadrille in December of 1916, as the original name implied that the US were allied to the French rather than neutral. The name was in honor of the Marquis de Lafayette, the French hero of the American Revolutionary War. The unit's aircraft, mechanics, and uniform were French, as was the commander, Captain George Thénault. 5 French pilots were also on the roster, serving at various times in command positions. It first saw action on May 13th of 1916 at the Battle of Verdun. In September 1917, the escadrille was transferred to the U.S. Army under the designation, as I said previously, the 103rd Aero Squadron. The escadrille painted a profile of Sitting Bull on the nose of their planes. Next slide. Bullard was first assigned Escadrille 93 and then to Escadrille 85 in September of 1917, where he remained until he left the French Air Corps. In November of 1917, Bullard claimed 2 actual aerial victories, but neither could be confirmed. Some accounts say that 1 victory was confirmed. During his flying days, Bullard is said to have had an insignia on his Spad 7 that portrayed a heart with a dagger through it and the slogan, as I said at the beginning, "All blood runs red." Reportedly, Bullard flew with a mascot, a rhesus monkey named Jimmy. He took part in about 20 combat missions and was called the Black Swallow of Death. His French Army unit had been known as the Swallows of Death. When the United States entered the war, United States Army Air Service convened a medical board to recruit Americans who were flying with the Lafayette Flying Corps for the Air Service. Bullard went through the medical examination, but was not accepted, as only white pilots were allowed to serve. Sometime later, on a short break from duty in Paris, Bullard allegedly got into a fight with a French commissioned officer and was punished by being transferred to the service battalion of the 170th, his former French Army unit. Remember, during all of this, he was only a corporal. Bullard believed racism caused him his dismissal and that the commandant used the incident as an excuse to suspend him. He served beyond the armistice, not being discharged until October 24th of 1919. Next slide, please. A memo signed by Colonel J.L.A. Leonard of the American Expeditionary Force Headquarters in August of 1918 voiced the Caucasian American concerns that African American soldiers and officers working with the French were being treated with too much familiarity and indulgence. It was entitled, Secret Information Concerning Black American Troops to the French military mission stationed with the American Army. This message aimed to discourage Frenchmen from treating African American troops with equal respect. What happened to Bullard may have been part of the general racism that began seeping into France, mainly promulgated by white US soldiers with a history of disparaging Black troops to the point of accusing them of rape and cowardice. This was particularly true if white soldiers witnessed Black troops carousing with white women. The quote on the screen is from the conclusion of the memo. I will read it for you. The Black man is regarded by the white American as an inferior being with whom relations of business or service are possible. We cannot deal with them on the same plane as with the white American officer without deeply wounding the latter. We must not eat with African Americans, must not shake hands or seek to talk or meet with them outside the requirements of military service. Next slide. For his World War I service, the French government awarded Bullard the Cross de Guerre, the Médaille Militaire, the Cross de Combat Volunteer, 1914 to 1918, and the Medal de Bourdon, along with several others. After his discharge, Bullard returned to Paris. His combat wounds entitled him to French citizenship. Bullard found work as a drummer and a nightclub manager at La Grande Duke, and he eventually became the owner of his own nightclub, La Escadrille. He was a celebrity in Paris. He employed Langston Hughes as a dishwasher in his cabaret. The singer Josephine Baker was his babysitter, and Ernest Hemingway based a character on him in one of his novels. In 1923, he married Marcelle Strawman from a wealthy family, but this ended in divorce in 1935, with Bullard gaining custody of their two surviving children, Jacqueline and Lolita. As a popular jazz venue, La Grande Duke gained him many famous friends, including, as I've said, Josephine Baker, Louis Armstrong, Langston Hughes, and the French flying ace, Charles Nungesser. Next slide, please. While the physical club he owned was destroyed in World War II, the spirit of the nightclub still exists in Paris now, known as Les Bars de la Escadrille. Next slide, please. When World War II began in Europe in September of 1939, Bullard, who also spoke German, agreed to a request from the French government to spy on the German citizens and French fifth columnists who still frequented his nightclub. Bullard attempted to rejoin the French army, but was considered too old. Following the German invasion of France in May of 1940, Bullard fled Paris with his daughters. He volunteered to serve with the 51st Infantry in defending Orleans. an officer whom he knew from the World War I Battle of Verdun, gladly accepted his offer to serve France again. He enlisted as a machine gunner in the 51st Infantry Regiment, was severely wounded by an exploding artillery shell. Despite his wounds, he was able to leave German-occupied France by getting on a bicycle and biking his way to Portugal and taking a Red Cross ship back to America, settling in the Harlem district of New York in July of 1940. He had to leave France because his work with the French government intelligence agency put his safety at risk. Next slide, please. After 28 years in Europe, Bullard returned to New York City, and it didn't take long for him to experience the stifling effects of Jim Crow laws. When his ship docked, white veterans were greeted by a representative of the American Legion who offered them a hotel and a small stipend. Bullard, the only Black veteran on the ship, was offered nothing. He found an apartment in Spanish Harlem and worked to arrange for his daughters to come to the States. Bullard spent some time in a New York hospital and never really fully recovered from his wound. Moreover, he found the fame he enjoyed in France did not follow him to the United States. In 1945, after the war had ended, he attempted to regain his nightclub in Paris, but it had been destroyed during the war. He received a financial settlement from the French government and was able to buy an apartment in Harlem, New York City. He worked as a longshoreman until it was too much for his war injuries. He worked as a security guard. He sold French perfumes. In 1950 and 51, he helped arrange his old friend Louis Armstrong's European bookings. Finally, he was offered a job as one of the elevator operators in the RCA building, which is today's Rockefeller Center. Next slide, please. In 1949, a concert held by Black entertainer and activist Paul Robeson in Peekskill, New York, to benefit the Civil Rights Congress resulted in the Peekskill riots. These were caused in part by members of the local Veterans of Foreign Wars and American Legion chapters who considered Robeson a communist sympathizer. The concert was scheduled to take place on August 27th in Lakeland Acres, north of Peekskill. Before Robeson arrived, however, a mob attacked the concert goers with baseball bats and stones. 13 people were seriously injured before police put an end to it. The concert was then postponed until September 4th. The rescheduled concert took place without incident, but as concert goers drove home, they passed through long lines of hostile locals who threw rocks through their windshields. Eugene Bullard was among those attacked after the concert. He was knocked to the ground and beaten by the angry mob, which included members of the state and local law enforcement. The attack was captured on film and can be seen in the 1970s documentary, The Tallest Tree in Our Forest, and the Oscar-winning documentary narrated by Sidney Poitier, Paul Robertson, Tribute to an Artist. None of the assailants was ever prosecuted. Graphic pictures of Eugene Bullard being beaten by two policemen, a state trooper, and a concert goer were published in Susan Robertson's biography of her grandfather, The Whole World in His Hands, a pictorial biography of Paul Robertson. Next slide, please. Bullard in his later years wore the French War Cross and the cap of the French War veterans. In the 1950s, Bullard was a relative stranger in his own homeland. His daughters had married and they lived alone in his apartment, which was decorated with pictures of his famous friends and a framed case containing his 15 French war medals. His final job was as an elevator operator at Rockefeller Center, where his fame as the Black Swallow of Death was unknown. In 1954, the French government invited Bullard to Paris to help rekindle the everlasting flame at the tomb of the unknown soldier under the Arch de Triomphe. He was flown to France to appear at banquets held by the Lafayette Flying Corps in 1954 and 1959. On his 64th birthday in 1959, he was made a Chevalier or Knight of the French Legion of Honor by French President Charles de Gaulle. As a result of this recognition, on December 22nd of 1959, he was interviewed on NBC's Today Show by David Garroway and received hundreds of letters from viewers. Bullard wore his elevator operator uniform during the interview. While this gained him some recognition, his last years were spent in relative obscurity and poverty in New York City. But back in France, in Paris, Bullard was still seen as a hero. Next slide, please. Eugene Bullard died in New York City of stomach cancer on October 12th of 1961 at the age of 66. He was buried with military honors in the French War Veterans section of the Flushing Cemetery in New York City borough of Queens. Eugene Bullard received 15 decorations from the government of France. Charles de Gaulle made him a Knight of the Legion d'Honneur, France's most coveted award. He was also awarded the Medal des Militaires, another high military distinction. In 1972, Bullard's exploits as a pilot were retold in a biography, The Black Swallow of Death. Bullard is also the subject of a nonfiction young adult memoir, Eugene Bullard, World's First Black Fighter Pilot by Larry Greenlee. On August 23rd of 1994, 33 years after his death and 77 years to the day after the physical that should have allowed him to fly for his own country, Eugene Bullard was posthumously commissioned a second lieutenant in the United States Air Force. The 2006 movie Flyboys loosely portrayed Bullard and his comrades in World War I. In 2012 to 2014, the French writer Claude Ribby wrote a book on Eugene Bullard and made a television documentary. On a trip to Paris that I will talk about on the next slide, I met Mr. Ribby and spoke with him about his research on Eugene Bullard and his family. Next slide. In 2016, I accompanied two documented original Tuskegee Airmen to support Secretary of the Air Force and the Vice Chief of Staff in recognizing the 100th anniversary of the Lafayette Escadrille. Secretary James had specifically requested that Tuskegee Airmen attend this celebration to help cement the connection between what Eugene Bullard accomplished and how it was tied to what the Tuskegee Airmen did in World War II. The Lafayette Escadrille Memorial Cemetery commemorates the birthplace of American combat aviation and serves as a symbol of the Franco-American comradeship during World War I. The site honors the American volunteer pilots who flew with French squadrons during World War I and is the final resting place in the memorial crypt. Are 68 sarcophagi, one for each of the aviators of the Lafayette Flying Corps who lost their lives during World War I. 49 of those aviators are entombed in the crypt, along with 2 of their French commanding officers. In January of 2017, the American Battle Monuments Commission officially assumed ownership and responsibility for the Lafayette Escadrille Memorial Cemetery, making it the 9th World War I cemetery administered by the agency. On the slide, you have the French Air Force flyby, and pictured is Secretary of the Air Force James, American Ambassador to France and Monaco Hartley, and Tuskegee Airman Ted Lumpkin and Eugene Richardson. Next slide, please. The French were not the only ones to do a flyby that day. A B-52 led the American flyby over the memorial, and it was followed by the F-22s you see on the screen. Heavy metal over downtown Paris. You can't beat that picture. Next slide, please. Lafayette Escadrille Memorial is half the size of the Arch de Triomphe. The sarcophagi are located beneath it. And you can see the names of those entombed on the archway there. Next slide, please. On October 9th of 2019, I attended the unveiling of this statue of Eugene Bullard at the Warner Robins Air Museum. Members of his extended family were in attendance. The date was the 124th anniversary of his birth. The museum also has a section dedicated to him in its displays. I will end this presentation as I do all of them. Next slide, please. Here is a picture that we should never forget. On 12 October of 2000, while at anchor refueling offshore in Aden, a port in Yemen, the USS Cole was attacked by two Al-Qaeda homicide bombers. And I use that term intentionally. If you want to be called a suicide bomber, get in front of a camera, stand in the middle of a field, and blow yourself up. Otherwise, you are a homicide bomber. They sailed a small boat next to the destroyer and detonated between 400 and 700 pounds of explosives. The blast created a 40 by 60 foot hole in the port side of the ship. The attack on the USS Cole killed 17 and wounded 39 sailors. The individuals pictured here are the crewmen from the Cole that were killed in that terrorist attack on their ship. Remember, this was a random attack on a random ship on a random day. Notice that those killed represent a slice of Americana. Every time a member of the armed forces and the Coast Guard put on a uniform, they are placing themselves in harm's way in defense of a dream. Every year, soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Coast Guardsmen, and the civilian employees from the active duty, the reserve, and the National Guard die in defense of a dream. We call that dream the freedom to live our way of life. As a personal note, I toured the Cole in port in January of 2000 before that deployment. I don't know if I met any of those who were killed or wounded that day, but I met America's finest. The folks who carried out that attack hate us, and they hate our way of life. They don't understand us. They kill for religious differences or family honor and wonder why we're not like them. Diversity is a strength, and one that those who oppose us cannot begin to understand. Today, I've connected the efforts of Eugene Bullard from World War I to the Tuskegee Airmen of World War II. What they did connects today into the future of our nation. Thank you for listening to me today. Next slide, please. Are there any questions?
Please, if you have questions, use the question icon button, type it in, and then I'll pass it over to General Johnson. Sir, I'd like to start while we're waiting for somebody in the audience to submit a question. Did he leave any letters, diaries, or memoirs that you were able to use in your research?
Yes, he was actually working with a writer to do his autobiography. And it is a collection of his memories. And remember, he's remembering this the way he wants to remember it. So there was always a little controversy and fact checking going on. There are at least 4 or 5 books out there you can find at Barnes & Noble that go through his life and all the different parts. I've given you the highlights of it, but there's a lot of depth to what he did, who he did, worked with, encountered, and just all the obstacles he overcame. I mean, if you think about it, at 11, you run away from home, live on your own for 6 years, stow away on a ship, go to a country you don't know the language, and learn the language, learn a third language, go to war. It's just amazing.
This question comes from John. John wants to know, has any U.S. military awards been given to him posthumously?
No, the only recognition he received was being made an honorary second lieutenant in the Air Force.
When was that done again?
Let me check my note to make sure I give you the right date. October. I have to go way back in my notes.
Okay.
That was on the 174th anniversary or 74th anniversary of his birth. So that
Okay.
would have been, I think, 2009.
Any his exhibit is, I'm not sure where is that Air Force base? Does he have anything at
It's
the
in Macon,
National Air
Georgia.
Part? Okay.
Yeah, it's Warner Robins. He's from Georgia, and Warner Robins, the Atlanta chapter of the Tuskegee Airmen, their local air power organization, and the museum all came together to make this thing happen, get the statue done, the dedication. I would say there were at least 1,500 people in attendance for this unveiling of this statue.
Okay. Sir, we have no other questions. What else would you like to comment on?
You know, history is a wonderful thing, and let us not forget all the things and the people who have made a difference. I mean, here's a man who made a difference. Very few people know who he is, and history even gets his story wrong, that he was the first Black pilot when he really was the first Black American fighter pilot. And again, you know, that you can look it up and research him, see all the other parts and aspects of his life. I mean, he was a boxer, and he was a pretty good boxer, and he was able to compete and win boxing matches, ran a sports club. You know, when he, I said he rode a bicycle after he was wounded to Portugal. He did it twice, because the first time he got over there and they needed more information, something he didn't have with him. So he had to go all the way back to France and then back to Portugal again on a bicycle.
One person comments that they believe he needs a Distinguished Flying Cross, at least for what he did.
It's a pretty amazing story.
I understand you're writing a book, and he's one chapter. Can you tell us a little about what you have at least as a thought at this time?
Well, the book has been outlined. It is the history of Blacks in aviation, and you bring out, you know, Eugene Bullard, the Tuskegee Airmen, Bessie Coleman, lots of individuals, Frank Peterson, who was a Marine aviator, lots of people who have made a difference out there and, you know, broke barriers, made, you know, Fig Newton, who was the first Black to fly for the Thunderbirds. So I walked through various chapters looking at various individuals and groups who along the way made a difference. I mean, Bessie Coleman was out there between wars as a stunt pilot. Probably did it for only about 5 years before she was killed in an airplane accident.
Well, we hope that this book, when it comes out, gets a wide distribution. And if you want to come back again and tell some of those, I hate to use the word stories, but some of those vignettes about their contributions, I'd gladly have you back. I hope that the folks who attended tonight, please just let others know about this talk, because as General Johnson indicated, we need to let the American public know the contributions of all who have served, especially some of our minorities, because quite often their story has not been told effectively. And this is one program that can get the word out so that others understand the contributions of all our citizens over time. So again, sir, thank you very much.
I'll give you one more plug for something to think about for a future year.
Okay.
You know, the Coast Guard has 3 icebreakers. Their light icebreaker, the Healy, is the one that's been out there the longest. And it's named after a gentleman who, from the Civil War time, was in the Revenue Cutter Service, which preceded the Coast Guard, and he was a Black individual.
Okay, sir. We'll keep that in mind. I'd like to invite everybody back on June 1st at 7 p.m. We're going to drop back about 150 years from World War I. We're going to have Colonel Retired Bill Wenger, who's going to talk about the keys to the American independence, a quantitative study looking at actually the support that France gave us during the War of the American Revolution. So again, thank you for everybody for joining us tonight. Sir, thank you for coming back again. And we look forward to talking to you sometime in the future.
All
Good
right,
night, all.
take care. Thanks
Thank
again.
you.
Bye.